He said he was about to change everything. Science, medicine, religion.
Chapter 1. Prologue. It has often been asked, if God exists, then why is there so much evil in the world? Surely if God is both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, he would put an end to evil at once. Yet evil exists. This conundrum is what is often called the problem of evil. The problem of evil presupposes the existence of a deity. Thus, to begin our examination, let us assume that God exists. Before we continue, however, it may be useful to make certain deductions from the existence of God. Chapter 2. God, the universe, and everything. It is said that God is the greatest conceivable being. If God does in fact exist, then curiously enough, this statement gives us predictions as to the nature of reality as well. To demonstrate what I mean, let us compare the concept of God with the concept of the All. If God is not the All, then there is a being that is greater than God, namely the system of God plus that part of the All which is not God. But then God would not be the greatest possible being, and therefore not God after all. Thus, if God really does exist, we must conclude that God is the same as the All. However, God is also said to be a mind. Therefore, if God is a mind, and God is the All, then the statement, the All is a mind, logically follows. Thus we see that the concept of God entails a curious consequence. If God exists, monistic idealism follows. But since the universe is within the All, you may ask, isn't the universe made of matter? This is actually not true.
There's another theorem which is called Koch and Specker theorem. It's much less known. And that theorem tells us that the culprit is actually our notion of reality. We know that it is wrong to assume that the features of a system which we observe in the measurement exist prior to the measurement.
But couldn't one say that this involvement of the observer is really just limited to very small quantum mechanical systems?
As people say that, and this is a comforting possibility, but there's no reason to believe that. Nothing in the theory tells us that.
Findings in modern physics tell us that both matter and space-time are fundamentally illusory, and that both are emergent from patterns of information that underlie them.
To get for a quantum theory of gravity is that space-time is not fundamental. That space-time is, if you like, an effective emergent description from something else that underlies it. And that something else could be information in the following way.
The conclusions of these findings have been summarized by computer scientist Brian Whitworth and popularized by NASA physicist Thomas Campbell. They show us that all the weirdnesses of modern physics suddenly make sense if we view the laws of physics as derived from the laws of information processing in a virtual reality. With this in mind, the concept of the universe being a conscious state in God's mind, as admittedly bizarre as it may sound, is actually quite plausible. Why? The conscious state, when viewed from the inside, is a virtual reality. The very same thing our best physics tells us about the universe we inhabit.
Underneath the molecules and atoms and particles, there's another layer of reality that's coming to light. It's a layer that's based on information.
With this understanding of God, we have come to interesting conclusions about the nature of reality itself. But what, you may ask, does all of this have to do with the existence of evil? Chapter 3. Privatio Boni. If God is the greatest conceivable being, then God would have to be identical to the Platonist conception of God as the good. Anything less than the good would have to be less than the greatest conceivable good, and thus not the greatest conceivable being. This appears to accentuate the problem of evil, though. We have already determined that God is the All. However, if God is the good, then it follows that the All is also the good. Yet evil exists and appears to be a part of the All. The only resolution to this paradox is that evil exists in the same way that shade or coldness exists, as an absence of good and not as a thing in itself. This is summed up in the Neoplatonist doctrine of privatio boni. Namely, evil is defined as the privation of good. Things would then be good insofar as they exist, and evil insofar as they are incomplete. Malice, for example, could be defined as a lack of goodwill, disease a lack of health, and war a lack of peace.
Kälte existiert nicht. Nach den Gesetzen der Physik ist das, was wir als kalt empfinden, nur das Fehlen von Wärme. Und existiert Dunkelheit, Herr Professor?
Selbstverständlich existiert sie.
Nein, sie ist nur das Fehlen von Licht. Wir können das Licht messen, aber die Dunkelheit nicht. Das Böse existiert nicht, genau wie die Kälte und die Dunkelheit. Gott hat das Böse nicht geschaffen. Es ist das Ergebnis dessen, was Gottes Hand noch nicht berührt hat.
Chapter 4. A short detour. Euthyphro's dilemma. Though not related to the problem of evil itself, it is worthwhile to examine the Euthyphro dilemma in light of what we have thus determined. The Euthyphro dilemma sets up a dichotomy between the following options. 1. The good is greater than God, therefore God is not the greatest possible being. 2. God is greater than the good, therefore the good is determined by God from outside of the good, making God akin to an Übermensch in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. But in Chapter 3, we determined an immediate solution to this problem. There is a third option. God is the good. But how do we know that the good is good for us? Might it be that the definition of the good is capricious to human standards of goodness? The panentheistic definition of God as the all resolves this problem as well. If God is the all, and God is a mind, then the all is a mind as determined in Chapter 2. However, this leads to another peculiar conclusion, namely that from God's perspective there is only one mind, God's. All other minds, even if they are unaware of it, are subsidiaries of God's mind.
So Neoplatonism was this search for truthful thinking, thinking with the mind of God. While man seems to have a mind and seems to have a knowing power, he is actually knowing with the mind of God, whether he knows it or not.
Thus the concept of God as a divine Übermensch becomes incoherent. God being the all would have no reason to harm any other mind any more than he would have a reason to harm his own body, and for exactly the same reason. Thus the conflict between selfishness and altruism would be superseded altogether. Having resolved the Euthyphro dilemma, let us return to our examination of the existence of evil. Chapter 5. Knowledge versus sensation in monistic idealism. In Chapter 2, we discovered that if God exists, that monistic idealism would also have to be true. Now, if monistic idealism were true, then the world would behave as a virtual environment. Coincidentally, exactly as we have discovered it behaves in modern physics. However, how would we determine what sensations instantiate within this virtual environment? Being in God's mind, anything within a virtual environment would be perceived as a conscious state, or knowledge, from above that virtual reality. Thus, knowledge of something would be perceived as a sensation of that same thing from within the virtual environment.
Who are the people?
Projections of my subconscious.
Yours?
Yes. Remember, you are the dreamer. You build this world. I am the subject. My mind populates.
For example, the knowledge of green, as perceived as a platonic entity from above, would instantiate from within the virtual environment as the empirical sensation of greenness on such things as trees, grass, and apples. Chapter 6. The existence of evil. Now, if mental knowledge of something is externally perceived as that thing from within the virtual environment, then how would evil exist within the virtual environment? Logically, it would mean that the conscious state comprising the virtual reality would know the knowledge of evil. However, there is a catch. As we learned in Chapter 3, evil is the absence of good and cannot exist on its own. Thus, for evil to exist, good must exist as well. Thus, for evil to exist within the virtual environment, the conscious state containing that virtual reality would have to know good as well. In other words, it would have to know the knowledge of good and evil. So what would it be like to know this knowledge of good and evil?
Probably wondering why I keep appearing in your memories. It's because I have inserted myself in them. Give you a lifetime of knowledge in a single syringe.
Now you know. If God does in fact exist, then the answer is that evil exists not because God will not stop it, but rather because he wanted to know the knowledge of good and evil. Chapter 7. The Resolution of Evil. Thus far, we have determined that if God exists, that the evil in the world can be explained by a conscious state in God's mind deciding to know the knowledge of good and evil. Let us refer to this part of God's mind as primal man. Individual minds would then exist as proverbial subdirectories of primal man.
And that our consciousness may be related to that initial conscious moment.
All of these minds would then know, and thereby also be corrupted by, the knowledge of good and evil.
A part of Voldemort's soul
fastened itself onto the only living thing it could find. Harry himself, a part of Voldemort, lives inside him.
The very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system.
However, evil, being an absence of good, could not be fixed from within the corrupted construct. It would be the same as trying to fix a car with only half of its parts. Regardless of the excellence of the work of the mechanics, the car could never be fixed.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known.
Programmed Smith has grown beyond your control. Soon he will spread through the city as he spread through the Matrix. You cannot stop him. But I can.
The only way for the situation to be rectified is if someone from outside of primal man showed up inside the corrupted construct yet was not corrupted by it.
I killed you, Mr. Anderson. I watched you die.
With a certain satisfaction, I might add.
And then something happened. Something that I knew was impossible, but it happened anyway. You destroyed me, Mr. Anderson.
Let us refer to this hypothetical figure as Second Man.
He's different. Your father was the creator.
How? He is the one.
Then by integrating into Second Man, individuals from Primal Man would lose the corruption of Primal Man and would be saved from the construct corrupted with the knowledge of good and evil. Chapter 8. Epilogue. Thus we have discovered that if God hypothetically exists, then the world would logically have to be a virtual construct.
The more interesting aspect to that question is, who's the programmer and where's the computer?
That's the Catholic Church, for God's sake.
And if God exists, then this would logically be the explanation of the existence of evil. And if Second Man were ever to hypothetically show up in it, then he would be the resolution of evil.
Professor, what is that?
Something beyond either of I have. A part of Voldemort sent here to die.
No! You can't take away my power!
And lastly, we would be most curious if anything in this hypothetical scenario bore a resemblance to those things that exist in the real world.
In your world, I have another name. You must learn to know me by it.